How arrested development influences attraction. So I want to revisit a dynamic that I've already talked about on the channel, Sex and the City, Carrie and Mr. Big. And I want to address the romantic dynamic a little bit deeper. So ironically enough, I believe in the past I've had, analyses where I was depicting, essentially one side's perspective and then another side's perspective. But with this one, I want to broaden perspectives and acknowledge the fact that both parties had a role to play in this very toxic and tumultuous dynamic. So first and foremost, I want to address Carrie and how arrested development influences attraction. So a taboo thing to dissect and discuss is there are two instances where we are attracted to an individual and it's almost like we are forcing the relationship to work. There are two reasons why this can happen. For one, it can be rejection. So as dissected in some other analyses, and it's pulling from the book All Strings Attached, The Queen's Quarrel, there are instances where you may be dealing with a toxic romantic cycle, and it's because of some kind of romantic wound that was presented to you when you were younger, or some kind of rejection, romantic rejection specifically, that you experienced in your past, and you keep reliving it because you haven't addressed the root issue. However, there is another taboo romantic root that I believe is important to assess here, and it's entitlement. And this is actually going to segue into Mr. Big's role as well. However, Carrie, in my opinion, also exhibited a little bit of romantic entitlement, and I'm going to break this down. So as I stated before, these upcoming analyses are designed to be thought-provoking. They're designed to elicit some critical analyses and obviously to address things from a not so typical or general perspective. So what is meant by entitlement? We'll start with Mr. Big. I believe Mr. Big's entitlement was rooted in the fact that he felt like he can have his cake and eat it too when it came to marrying Natasha, but also still entertaining Carrie. Why does this happen? Because the other party likes the attention that they're receiving from the person that they know they're not necessarily interested in committing to, at least not at that given point in time. Because I believe like in the branch off and in the other series, they did end up together, Mr. Big and Carrie. However, there's also another form of entitlement, and this is a road less traveled. And what I mean by road less traveled is it's a perspective that typically people do not dissect and own up to. There is also a form of entitlement when it comes to the party who is receiving mistreatment. So this is separate from them, being exploited. This is also separate from them not realizing that they are operating from some kind of rejection wound, a romantic root that they haven't addressed yet. There's also a form of entitlement, though, when it comes to the rejected party or the perceived rejected party. What can happen is the person will display elaborate affection and attention, give these romantic gestures or display broad romantic gestures as a way to force the other party's hand. So entitlement can also look like forcing a connection to work, forcing a connection to happen because we want it to, rather than acknowledging the fact that the other party has free will and they have the option to say, you know what, I just don't feel like this is a fit. And in a short that I recently posted, I talked about this from reading from, another excerpt in the book, All Strings Attached. And in the book, it states that, it's important to not perceive romantic protection as rejection. What is meant by this? An instance where both parties are not on the same page as far as romantic intentions and efforts. Someone willingly and willfully backing out and stepping down is actually protection. That's what you want. And that's why later on in that same excerpt, it talks about the importance of implementing your own vetting process and not jumping. I don't want to use that word on YouTube, but not getting hasty and ahead of yourself, right? Because that vetting process is actually doing exactly what it's designed to do. You do not want to force someone's hand into a situation where you're on one accord and the person is on a completely different accord. And once things hit the fan, now you're crying and you're breaking down and you're confused, but you're not understanding that the two worlds were already colliding during that vetting process. It's just you weren't acknowledging what that vetting process was showing you. You weren't receptive to the red flags that were presented. And a telltale sign of this when we reference, Mr. Big and Carrie's dynamic on the hit TV show, Sex and the City, The instance where Mr. Big, did all of that, they ended up, y'all, this is so ghetto. This is so ghetto. Did all of that and ended up in her wedding dress with all her friends present. And on the day of, he's in the back of a cab talking about I can't do this, and pulled out of the wedding, of the reception on the day of. But mind you, there were so many instances, red flags of Mr. Big's inconsistencies prior to that point. So this is how arrested development can negatively impact attraction. You are trying to force a shoe to fit, but you don't realize that your feet have corns on them. They have bunions. They're blistering. Like, you have to take the shoe off and accept the fact that taking the shoe off and allowing it to be passed on to the next person is actually better for you, so you could find a shoe that actually fits. Now, the next romantic taboo that we're going to address, and the romantic elephant in the room, is the desire to make your romantic partner your parent. Once I dissected the dynamic between Mr. Big and Carrie again, I couldn't help but acknowledge the fact. Now, mind you, I personally like Carrie. I know you guys aren't fond of her, but I like her. I feel like Carrie was just beautiful, loved her style, loved her. I don't know, she was just vibrant. She was fun. She was playful. I know a lot of us, we just felt like when it came to love, we were like, girl, you're just all over the place, but that's fine. I still like Carrie, and I still was rooting for my sis. But I will be fair, though. After hearing you all's feedback and rewatching certain clips and broadening my own perspective, I was like, but wait a minute. Even though Mr. Big definitely displayed some signs of narcissism, not saying that, I'm going to slap the label on him. You guys know how I feel about that, because I feel like narcissistic personality disorder, the diagnosis can be thrown around like candy. But I will say this, he definitely displayed a lot of narcissism in respects to his relationship with Carrie, or his dynamic with Carrie. But and also Natasha too. Like, how are you married to Natasha and you're still rolling in bed with Carrie? That was completely out of bounds, right? Because you took the vows, not Carrie. But nevertheless, I had to be fair and think about the fact that maybe some of Carrie's habits is also what played a part in, them not being on the same accord and the same page. And I'm not really in the business of comparing women, but when we think about why Natasha ended up getting married to Mr. Big versus Carrie, and why Carrie had a lot of hostility, is, if we're being honest, even though Natasha was significantly younger than Carrie, Natasha was more mature. And in one of my analyses, I broke this down. I actually concluded that watching the clips objectively, Natasha displayed more maturity in comparison to Carrie and Mr. Big, right? And it showed in her actions. It showed in the way that she conducted herself. Even once the relationship went sour, she still held herself with a level of dignity and grace. And she was able to acknowledge the fact that, I even take accountability for the fact that I know that Mr. Big is still messing with you and still has feelings with you, but I keep choosing to turn a blind eye to it. And now look at the state of my relationship and really the state of my own well-being, because I kept turning a blind eye to something that was clearly a problem. And I think that's actually why Mr. Big decided to marry Natasha, because she did have that level of emotional maturity. So tying this back to Carrie and why I stated that, observing these clips again, I realized Carrie's role in this dynamic and how, it ended up going left, is I do believe that Carrie was, to her own demise, constantly displaying the damsel in distress. Now, when it comes to romantic partnerships, and Mr. Big, displaying the fact that at some point he did want to commit and settle down, when you are someone who is still acting as if you are a child in a romantic capacity, it can hinder your ability to actually achieve commitment, because you're not necessarily in the emotional state to meet your romantic partner halfway. And to describe this further, I'm going to read from another excerpt in the book, All Strings Attached, The Queen's Quarrel. Playing damsel in distress can become dangerous. A mistake many make regarding romantic partnerships is expecting parenting in a romantic partner. Romantic relationships that sustain and grow through the test of time typically have a strong foundation in teamwork, collaboration, and partnership. With maturity, your romantic and relational appetite will change. Desire for partnership and productivity will override sexual desires and physical attraction. Frivolous escapades will become a thing of the past when one assesses the deep need for a stable foundation and legacy building. The partner who is operating in immaturity will become a burden. Unfortunately, such a burden will override physicality. The person who is always falling short will soon become a liability rather than a lover. I remember having a conversation amongst a group, and we obviously had to talk about romance, dating, love, all of that. This was a couple years ago. And I remember everyone had to share their perspectives. And when it got to me, I remember saying something along the lines of I don't necessarily need my romantic partner. And immediately the person got up. They stood up and was like, what do you mean? They were like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I said, I don't necessarily need my partner. That's just my take on it in an emotional state, in a mental state. And some people are just like, that doesn't make any sense. How can you rely on your partner without needing them? And just to give some context, I'm going to give spiritual context as far as what I mean by this, because I feel like that's the only way that I can explain this and break this down. There's scripture in the Bible that says, guard your heart, because from your heart flows the issues of life, just to paraphrase. But one thing that always stood out to me was in that scripture, it said, guard your heart. And as believers, we think that that's just the introduction. When you're first meeting someone, guard your heart. But as I've matured, I realized that guarding your heart is actually a lifelong practice, because there are going to be instances where you are having a disagreement with a loved one and they're not in the best state. They're in an emotionally intoxicated state, and they may spew some hateful things. They may do something to sabotage the relationship, and you have to take the initiative. There's also another scripture that talks about taking captive every thought and making it obedient to Christ. So you always should be doing your due diligence as a believer, no matter who you're in a relationship with. You always have that responsibility. Now, of course, you do become one when you're in a romantic partnership or romantic covenant with another person. However, it doesn't negate the fact that you are still doing your work and you are still making sure that you're stewarding your own thoughts, because there may come a day where someone completely leaves the path. So when I said that, the person immediately stood up and looked at me crazy, and I was looking at them like, yeah, I said what I meant and meant what I said. I don't necessarily need to need emotionally or mentally my romantic partner, because there may come a time, not necessarily saying that it has to lead to the extreme of you all up and leaving one another one day. That's not always the case, but there absolutely will come times where your partner is just not in a stable state, whether it be emotionally, mentally. There may be some other things that they're battling, and sometimes that hate they will spew off onto you. And you may have to deal with some of those negative projections, but it's your responsibility to make sure that you don't internalize it, because two wrongs don't make a right. So as I stated in a previous analysis, this ideology that love and logic cannot coexist is counterproductive, because there are going to be instances where you are dealing with a romantic partner or a romantic prospect, and because they're not doing their emotional labor, they're going to try to spew that off onto you and project that onto you. And it's going to be logic that helps you perceive the fact wait a minute. Although this is an emotionally charged situation, I can view the fact that this person is going through something right now and they're having a difficult time dealing with it, and they're trying to pass the emotional buck on to me. And it's my responsibility to make sure that I keep my boundaries in place. I can support this person. I can still be there for this person while also holding them accountable and letting it be known, wait a minute, this isn't my baggage to carry. I'm here to support you. I'm here to help you. But it's not fair for you to pass this on to me, knowing that this is something that you need to work on. So in sum, emotional maturity and emotional regulation helps you perceive when arrested development is negatively impacting your romantic attraction. All right, babes, that's all that I have for this analysis today. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. But of course, I want to hear you all's comments, opinions, perspectives, as well as your personal experiences in the comment section below. I look forward to speaking to you guys in the next analysis, babes. Take care.